Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael and I'm making a dingy back street behind the grand buildings of High Street on my N-gauge model railway layout set in 1993. With the town hall and revs complete, it was time to make the ground, and I think I'm well on the way to achieving that run-down dingy look that I'm after. Join me in this video to see how I made a dingy back street in Chandwell. With a temporary card surface in place, I glued small strips of paper to cover the gaps between the card and the building edges. This would help me to get the final surface exactly the right shape. Once the glue was dry, I moved revs away and the town hall extension, and this enabled me to peel away the ground surface. I took care not to tear the new paper parts, and the ground came away in one piece, and it's exactly the right shape to fit the space available. There is very little flat ground on Chandwell, and this back street is no exception. The ground falls from the front of the buildings to the back, and also from the back of the layout to the front, towards the level of the River Chanda. The level changes are subtle here, only about 3mm, but I think they really enhance the realism of this little back street. I used card to get the levels of the ground right. The narrow alley between Ben's beds and revs is just a few pieces of packaging falling from front to back. Ribs of card fall gently from the back of the layout to the front, and a pile of 0.5mm card helps the ground fall from Water Lane onto the back street in a nice way. This bit here is flat to act as a base for the forthcoming water building. I taped the grounds template onto a sheet of 0.5mm card to stop it from moving around. I then carefully cut around the template. I used the steel rule for the parts that needed to be straight, and the scalpel, freehand, for the curved and knobbly bits. I was using thin card so that it would gently bend into shape across the undulating levels of the support structure that was glued to the baseboard. There were a surprisingly high number of knobbly bits, but I took my time and methodically worked my way around the shape. I was eventually done, and the new shape was ready to receive its surface. I was inspired by those back streets of Otley that I showed a couple of episodes ago, so I printed a narrow, central, concrete drainage gully, a few bits of scale scenes tarmac, some concrete, some cobblestones, and some stone sets. With that all printed, I sketched roughly what I wanted to achieve directly onto the card. I loved the sets that crossed the real back street in Otley, so I used a texture downloaded from textures.com and glued a strip across the end of the street. Simple concrete went down where the water building is going to be. I'm using PVA glue to hold the textures in place. I wanted to model the impression of potholes. I used simple watercolour paint to add splotches of dirty ground here and there. I enjoyed making this mess. The road will be tarmac that has been applied on top of cobbles. I cut a few patches of scale scenes cobblestone texture and cut away some holes in that. These went on top of the dirty ground, and I took care to align the cobbles with the alignment of the street. With these patches in place, I added the central drainage gully and was ready to add the tarmac. I decided to keep the tarmac in good condition along the edge of the gully, but to cut the building side edges in a wavy way. I also cut holes in the texture to represent the areas where the cobbles underneath are showing through. Before gluing, I went around the exposed edges with watercolour paint to remove the white paper edges. Once cut to shape and the edges painted, I carefully applied the texture with PVA glue. I took care to align the tarmac along the central gully and against the stone sets at the ends of the street. Once in place, I flipped the part over and trimmed away the excess, and then did a little more peeling away of the unglued parts above the cobbles. A test fit with the ground resting on its supports showed that I was on the right lines. It was time to get this all fitted down. The ground would not go down with revs in place, but revs included some edge supports for the ground, which needed to go underneath the ground. It was therefore essential that the ground was glued down at the same time as revs. I covered the support with Oohoo glue, and the bottom of revs too. I then ever so carefully dropped the ground into place on its supports. I took care to ensure that the edges all aligned with the parts that they should. Then holding up the revs end, I grabbed revs and jiggled it around and started to lower it into place. Everything was a tight fit, so it took some coaxing to get it into place and the thin sheet of ground slotted around it and up against the viaduct. Eventually it was all in place and I could smooth down the ground and ensure that everything was stuck properly. My tweezers helped smooth down the ground in the narrow alley. Dingy back streets beside dingy urban streams generally have a green kind of tone. I used various shades of green watercolour and I slapped it all over the edges of the ground. This was after covering the ground with a couple of coats of matte varnish, I must add. A scrap of toilet paper was then used to dab it all away. This leaves a lovely green tint that allows the texture to still shine through. So the as yet unnamed back street beside the as yet unnamed stream is nearing completion. I am pleased with how it's starting to look, especially this view from the front, along the stream, under the arch and to the job centre beyond. I still have a lot of bits of detail to add to really bring it to life. Join me next week when we will take a look at this incredibly fine chain link fence that I've added. Speaking of the job centre, here's a look at how I made that at the beginning of this year. So until the chain link fence next week, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.